In this video, we are going to talk about simplifying radical expressions as well as solving by square root method. So first, I'd like you to take a look at this warm-up, pause the video, and give 1 through 6 a try. So in 1 through 6, these are all perfect squares. So when you take the square root of each of these numbers, they're going to come out to a nice whole number. Now, this only happens for our perfect squares. So today we're going to talk about how we simplify a radical that is not a perfect square. So when simplifying a radical, we need to determine what perfect squares are factors. And we can pull a number outside of the square root when it is a perfect square. And a number has to stay underneath the square root when it is not a perfect square. So what are perfect squares? So our perfect squares are 1, but we don't really use 1. So 4, 9, 16, 25, 36, 49, 64, 81, 100, and then there's even more from there. But those are the main ones we're going to focus on today. Another important thing to know is a prime number. So a prime number has only, its only factors are 1 in itself. And the number. So for example, again, 1 is kind of a prime number, but we're not going to use that. So 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, 13, 17, 19, 23, 29, and there's more from there. But again, those numbers have no factors other than 1 in that number. So when we go to simplify a square root, I need to think about all the factors of 24. So if I'm thinking about the factors of 24, 1 and 24, 2 and 12, 3 and 8, 4 and 6. Then I want to find the factor that is the biggest perfect square. So if I'm thinking about 24, I'm going to list my factors up to 16, because if I do 25, that's too big. So we won't use 25. So based on the factors and based on my perfect squares, I can see that 4 is a perfect square and a factor. So I'm going to break down 24 as 4 times 6. And so that's the square root of 4 times the square root of 6. Now 4 is a perfect square, so the square root of 4 is going to become 2. Square root of 6 is not a perfect square, so it's going to stay in the radical. And so this is the simplified version of the square root of 24 is 2 square root 6. Let's try this again for 90. So first I'm going to make a factor tree for 90. So 1 and 90, 2 and 45, 3 and 30, 4 does not go into 90, 5 and not 16, 17, 18, 6 and 15. Yeah, 90 has a lot of factors. 7 does not go to 90, 8 does not, but 9 does, 9 and 10. Okay, so then I want to think about my perfect square. So 4, 9, 16, 25, 36, 49, 64, 81, 100. Again, 100 is too big. So looking at my list of perfect squares and my list of factors, I want to find the biggest factor that's also a perfect square. So in this case, that's going to be 9. 9 is a perfect square, and it's the biggest perfect square that goes nicely into 90. So I'm going to change 90 into square root of 9 times the square root of 10. Square root of 9 is going to become 3. And the 10 is going to stay inside because it's not a perfect square. So the square root of 90 will simplify to 3 square root 10. Okay, let's do a couple more examples. All right, so 32. So again, I'm going to list factors of 32. 1 and 32, 2 and 16, 3, 4 and 8, 5, 6. So those are all the factors. Then I'm going to think about my perfect squares. Oop, 36 is too big. So when I'm looking at my perfect squares for 32, there's actually 2 perfect squares. 16 and 4 are both factors. but I always want the biggest factor. So in this case, I'm going to work with 16 and 2 because I always want to do the biggest factor. So 32 is going to be 16 times 2, which is square root of 16 times square root of 2. So that'd be 4 square root 2. All right, I want you to pause the video now, and I want you to try 4, 5, and 6. When you're ready, go ahead and play the video, and we will work those out together. All right, so for 120, I'm going to start listing my factors of 120. So 1 and 120, 2 and 60, 3 and 40, 4 and 30, 5 and 24, 6 and 20, I think that's it. Nope, it's not it. 10 and 12. I think that's it then. So then let's think about perfect squares. I wrote those in the wrong order. 4, 9, 16, 25, 36, 49, 64, 81, 100. So based on when I'm looking at this list, the biggest perfect square that I see is actually 4. So even though that's kind of a small number for 120, it's the biggest perfect square that goes into 120. So I'm going to do 4 times 30, which is square root of 4 times square root of 30. Square root of 4 becomes 2. So 120 is going to simplify to 2 square root 30. All right, let's do the same for 75. So 75 factors, 1 and 75, 3 and 25, 5 and 15. Thinking about my perfect squares. The biggest perfect square that goes into both is going to be 25. So I'm going to rewrite 75 as 25 times 3. And so square root of 75 is going to simplify into 5 square root 3. All right, for 180, I'm going to list my factors. This is also going to have a lot of factors. So 1 and 180, 2 and 90, 3 and 60, 4. Let's see, does 4 go into 180? It does. 4 and 45, 5 and 36, 6 and 30, 9 and 20, 10 and 18, 12 and 15. Whew, a lot of factors. Okay, I think that's about all of them. All right, so then let's think about perfect squares. So again, 4, 9, 16, 25, 36, 49, 64, 81, 100. Now for me, let's see, the biggest perfect square that goes into 180 is actually 36. So here's 36. So we're going to break down 180 into 36 times 5. So it would simplify to 6 square root 5. So the reason we need to know how to simplify square roots is because we're going to solve by square roots, and sometimes they're not going to be perfect squares. So let's try some of this solving. So anytime I have an x squared, the opposite of squaring something is square rooting something. So I'm going to square root both sides. Now, when I think about 4 squared gives me 16, but remember, negative 4 squared will also give you positive 16. So when we're solving a square root, we're always going to get 2 answers, positive and negative 4. So you can either write that as positive and negative 4, or we can write it in this combined form where we write plus and minus 4. So either way you write your answers is fine, but we're always going to have 2 answers. Okay, we're always going to have 2 answers. So in 8, I need to get the x squared alone, so I'm going to add 1. Then I want to get rid of the squared, so I'm going to take the square root of both sides. And x is going to equal positive and negative 5, because that is what the square root of 25 would give me. In 9, we're going to have a couple more steps. So I need to minus the 2 first to get the 3x squared alone. Then I'm going to divide by 3 to get the x squared alone. And then my last step is I am going to square root both sides. And the square root of 9 is 3, so positive and negative 3 are going to be my solutions. All right, I want you to pause the video now, and I would like you to give 10 a try. When you're ready, go ahead and play the video. So in 10, we would add 98. Divide by 2. Since my x squared is now alone, I'm going to take the square root of both sides, and I would get plus or minus 7. Okay, so those all came out nice because those were all perfect squares. Now we're going to look at 2 examples where they are not perfect squares. So in 11, again, I'm going to follow the same steps. So I'm going to get the x squared alone by minusing 5, divide by 2, and then I'm going to go take the square root of both sides. And I'm always going to get plus or minus an answer. So in this case, 6 is not a perfect square, so I'm going to leave it as the square root of 6. But then I have to decide if this is going to simplify like we did earlier in the notes. So let me think about factors of 6. So 1 and 6, 2 and 3. And then let's think about my perfect squares. Now the only perfect square that would really work to go into 6 would be 4. And since 4 is not a factor of 6, this does not simplify, so we're going to leave it like this. If there was a factor that was a perfect square, then we would simplify it like we did above. Let's try that same idea on 12. So let's get the x squared alone. Divide by the number in front of the x squared. Then I'm going to take the square root of both sides. And so x is going to equal plus or minus square root of 12. Because again, 12 is not a perfect square. But let's see if we can simplify 12. So I'm going to think about factors of 12. And then I'm going to compare that to my perfect squares. So the only options would be 4 or 9. In this case, 4 is a perfect square and a factor. So we can simplify square root of 12 into square root of 4 times square root of 3, because 4 times 3 would give me 12. And 4 is a perfect square, so this 4 is going to become a 2. And so this would simplify into plus or minus 2 square root 3.